In the last video, we completed the last step in our Prisma Nexus workflow, which is implementing the GraphQL server using GraphQL Nexus. In this video, we're going to dive into the playground just to take a look at the automatically generated CRUD functionality that was generated using that plugin. So let's go ahead and open up the GraphQL playground. And last time we did try to look at the employees, but it returned an empty array. So obviously we have to create an employer and some employees. So let's open up a new tab and let's do a mutation, and let's create it. Let's call it a create employer, and we're going to give it a parameter of $data, and this is going to take in a type here. But in order to find out what type it is, open up the schema part on the right and find the create employer query or mutation. Open that up, and it's going to tell you up at the top, the type that it takes in. So this data takes in employer created input and it's required. So go ahead and put that up there. And you're going to open it up with the object bracket, and you're going to specify create employer. And this is going to take in a parameter of data and value of $data that we had just defined up above. This is going to open up a curly bracket, and anything that you put here, this is just the return properties that it's going to display after you execute this mutation. So whenever you create this employer, you can return properties, and so we can just do like ID, name, email. Let's do created at and updated at. And now we have to basically define what parameter is actually being passed in to define this new employer, and that's this data field, but we have to define what's actually in that data field. So you open up this query variables and just open up your curly bracket, and if you hit control space, that's what I'm using to do the autocomplete that you may have seen. Go ahead and enter, and this data, do the same thing, open up object, and then you can define whatever parameters you want to use. So if you remember in our Prisma data model, we actually had an ID primitive on the ID. So if we come back here and look at our data model, we can see on the employer we had this ID primitive that actually is going to auto generate the ID for you, so you don't actually need to define it here. So instead we're just going to define the name, and I'm going to call this MacBoy Digital. And you can also, I'll do an email too. So I'll do macboydigital@gmail.com. And that's really all I'm going to define. This created at and an update at. This is actually a primitive that we're using with Prisma, so that's auto-generated as well. So if I try to run this, so if we look here, we can see that the created at and update at values are wrong. These are null when they shouldn't be. They should be a system generated date. So there is a little bit of an error in my implementation. If we go back to the data model.prisma file, if we take a look here, we can actually see that I specified the wrong primitive. I specified create at rather than created at. So I'll just go ahead and update that. Now I'll update the name as well to do created at and updated at. And I'll make this required too, just to be consistent. So do created at, updated at. And I'll save this. Now you may be asking yourself, well, how do I update our configuration with these updates? So you would do that by redeploying Prisma and then running yarn start again. However, before we do that, we want to make sure that we clean up the invalid value, because this is a required field now, and since it's null, Prisma would get mad at us. So let's just go back to our playground, and we're going to actually delete this value. So let me just open up 2 more tabs here, and I'll just run in one file. I'll just list out the employers. So ID, name, and employee. I'll let this run. It just returns my one employer, which I failed to generate. Now I'm going to create another mutation, which is actually a good exercise. This is going to be, if we look at our schema over here, it's going to be delete employer. So as we can see here, it takes this input of like a where, and then whatever this is. So we'll say delete employer. We'll specify $data, and I'll do the type. I'll open that up, and I'll specify delete employer again, and then I'll specify where, and I'm just going to pass in $data that I defined up here. We're going to define a few return items, just ID, name, email, and then in our query variables, this is where we'll actually define the data that we specified up here. So that's going to be data, and this is actually going to be ID. If we hit Control Space, it'll tell us, and we'll just input the ID from our invalid employer. So then we'll just paste that in there, and let me collapse that, and let's run this. And okay, great. So that's deleted. It'll go back to the employer list. We can run it here. We can see that it's gone. So that's good. So let's go and redeploy Prisma. This is a lot of work, but we're learning a lot, so that's good. So we can cancel out of this. Let me clear it, and make sure that this file is saved up here, and just run Prisma deploy, and it's running and it's creating the stuff, running Prisma generate and the Nexus Prisma generate, auto generator CRUD, and now it's good to go. So we can run yarn run start again. And now it should be ready. So let's go back to here, and let's come back to create employer. So now we should be able to recreate MacBoy Digital, but hopefully that these fields should now populate. So let me run this, and I got an error. Oh, sorry. Let me just, I forgot to change that. Created at and updated at. The browser, the autocomplete's not working because I need to refresh the browser. Let me see that. Yeah, okay, so those are better now. So let me run this again. Yay, it's there. Okay, system generated date timestamp, so good. Let's go ahead and just create another employer. I'll just call it Raise Automotive, and I'll just say maybe Raise 1978 or 1078 at gmail.com. I'll run that. All right, so it's got both of those. If I come back over to the employers query and rerun this, yes, I can see those now, so great. All right, great. So the employers are now created. Now we can create some employees. And when we create the employees, we can actually specify what employer they're associated to. So I can open up another tab here, and I can do mutation, create employee, and this is going to have $data, and again we have to open up schema, and we'll have to find the type here. So created input, exclamation point. Open that up, and we can do create employee. Data is $data, and we can specify what return parameters. So I'll just do the ID, name, email, created at, updated at, status. I'll just do those for now. And this is where the fun part comes in on the query variables. Just hit Control space again for the autocomplete. Now we'll specify, we won't specify an ID because that's auto-generated. I'll just do a name. I'll put Corey McAvoy, comma, and then email, CoreyMcAvoy@gmail.com. And then I'll do, that's all I'll do. I'll take that comma out. Now there's one more thing we have to do. We have to associate it with an employer. So you actually come down here and type in employer. You'll open this up as an object. And you're going to want, you could either create a new employer or you can connect it to an existing one. So I want to connect it to an existing employer that I already created. So I can do connect and then open up an object, and you're going to specify an ID. And I'll have to specify the ID of the employer. So I can find out what the ID of my employer is by coming over to the employer tab. And I want McAvoy Digital, so I'll just copy this guy. And I'll create another ID. And I'll save this, or sorry, I'll execute this. And it created a new employee. Let me just create a few more employees, and then I'll show you how the relationships work together. I'll just specify, some random names here. Whatever comes to my head. And I'll connect this to the employer as well. And let me do the same thing for Ray's Automotive. So I'll do Ray Stevenson. Ray.stevenson@gmail.com. And I'm going to specify the different ID, Ray's Automotive ID. Connect that there. So I got Ray Stevenson, and I'll just say, like Bob Smith. I'm gonna run that. All right, now I've got 4 employees and 2 employers. Now what I can do is I can open up one of the queries that we did before. And so on the employer list, you may have seen that I could actually do another parameter here. For example, I could do employees, and I can look at a subtype, or it's basically a subquery, and I can specify the name and email, and I guess maybe status of the employees. I'll actually do the ID too. And so what you'll see here, you'll have each employer listed with their attributes, and then you've got the employees listed with each of the employees' attributes. So I've got McAvoy Digital with Corey McAvoy and Sarah Cahill as employees, and then I've got Ray's Automotive with Ray Stevenson and Bob Smith as employees. And these can actually infinitely nest if I wanted to. This is the beauty of GraphQL. I could do employer, and then list out name, email, and then employees, and then name, email. So you could get really, really deep with this if you wanted to. But that's just the beauty of GraphQL. All right, so that's a good overview of navigating CRUD functionality with Prisma and Nexus. I'm going to take a pause here, In the next video, I'm going to do a thing called a computed field, which is a Nexus feature, and then also a hiding certain elements or hiding certain schema using Nexus. So see you in the next video.